I like to think of myself as a practical idealist. I'm an idealist because I want to transform, as Adam just highlighted, the chemical industry. It's a $5 trillion industry globally, and unfortunately, its products, many of its products, are unhealthy for people and the environment. And I want to transform that industry from an industry that's based on toxic chemicals to one that's based on safer alternatives. And I'm practical because I see the value of how can environmentalists work with business to make this change, to transform this industry to using chemicals that are healthy for people and the environment. So I see ourselves as bridging this divide. Like, how do you take the mission and the values and the passion of environmentalists and combine that with the business community to create change? Because the business community is part of the problem, but it's totally going to be part of the solution, right? As environmentalists, I'm not going to be creating new chemistries. I'm not going to be creating new products, but we want to figure out how can we make this divide. So I want to ask you a question, which is to think about chemicals. When you think about chemicals for a moment, what comes to mind? Now, you might think of a beaker. So if you Google images for chemicals, right, you get a beaker, you could get the periodic table, you could get a molecular structure, something probably not thinking about. Or you might have thought of, well, when I think of chemicals, I think of toxic chemicals. How many of you thought of toxic chemicals when you thought of chemicals? About 2/3 of you. And so right now, for example, when we think of toxic chemicals, something that's really in the news, right, is lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, right, from the water in the pipes. And we care about this, of course, because lead is a neurotoxicant, right? It reduces the neurological developmental abilities and leads to lower IQ, for example. And so one of the challenges here, right, is we know that there are many different chemicals out there that cause adverse health effects, right? That they cause cancer, they cause neurodevelopmental disabilities, like reduced IQ, like increasing rates of ADHD or autism. And so we tend to think of chemicals a lot of times in this space of being toxic, right? And one time I saw a label that said chemical-free. And when you see a product that says chemical-free, be wary. But the idea, right, of course, is that it's toxic-free. But chemicals are really part of everything, right? Everything in this room consists of chemicals, and a lot of that is synthetic chemistry. So like the chairs that you're sitting on are made with a nylon fabric, that's made from synthetic chemistries. The foam underneath it, also synthetic chemistry, and added to that foam are brominated flame retardants, for example. And many of these brominated flame retardants are toxic. And here in Washington State, there's been a lot of efforts. Many of these flame retardants have been banned. But what happens when you have certain types of chemicals that are persistent and bioaccumulative, they get out into the environment and they spread across the globe. So brominated flame retardants has spread across the entire globe and contaminated the world. And other chemicals in this class of persistent bioaccumulative toxics then contaminate the environment, right? So orcas all will have brominated flame retardants in them. The developing fetus will actually have brominated flame retardants. And this is one of the sad parts of our industrial economy, is that the developing fetus is born actually pre-polluted with chemicals in them, right? And the fetus and the orca whale doesn't need brominated flame retardants in it. So we want to make that change, right? We want to move to safer alternatives. And so one of my lines is, right, all chemicals are not created equal. So we think of H2O, water, right? Water is safe and healthy. It's essential for life. We bathe in it. We drink it. It's in the air vapor, right? So water is essential. And that's an example, though, of a green chemistry, right? So this image behind me, right, is that's the image where I want to move, right? How do we move away from chemicals that are inherently toxic to chemicals that are inherently safer for people and the environment? Now, trying to make this change, though, is you operate, so I'm working in an environmental group, and I operate in a contested environment. Because when I go out and say, well, these brominated flame retardants are causing adverse health effects in people and the environment, well, there's companies, of course, that manufacture those chemicals. And so the chemical industry is an odd industry where its products are actually oftentimes the target for elimination. Right? Not many sectors, not many businesses have products that people want to remove from the marketplace. And so they are vehemently opposed to these types of changes. So they'll say, those brominated flame retardants, they're really not toxic. Well, then the evidence comes out they are toxic. Well, people aren't exposed to them. And then the evidence comes out they're exposed to them. And then they go, well, you're exposed, but they don't cause adverse health effects. Right? And these are some folks at Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, called these like the 3 stages of denial of the chemical industry. So it's a contested space, right? It's really hard to make these changes. And so this is where it comes in for me. It was like when I started on my career, I never saw myself as one that would be collaborating with business to create change. I saw it as I would be compromising, my values and my mission, and we wouldn't really create the change that we wanted to create. And my journey changed when I started my dissertation research, where I was looking at technology change in the pulp and paper industry, and I was looking what was happening in Sweden and the US. And there was a very interesting movement in the industry from chlorine breaching to chlorine-free breaching. I learned about this interesting campaign, what we now call market campaigns in my community. And these are initiatives by environmental groups. They can be also social movements, where you're trying to change business through markets. And at the time, Greenpeace was looking to try and change the pulp and paper industry. And they weren't getting much progress with the manufacturers, so they went to the large purchasers of paper. And in Europe, 2 effective initiatives, they targeted the publisher of Der Spiegel, which is a German magazine like Time, and they also targeted IKEA. It's sort of interesting. Why IKEA, right, a furniture store company, for paper? Well, of course, what was IKEA doing, and this was back in the 90s a lot, how were they doing their marketing? Through catalogs. So IKEA was a big buyer of paper. And so market campaigns go and you look to leverage change in the marketplace by working with the downstream users of chemicals, those organizations that use chemicals by virtue of the products that they purchase versus that they're the manufacturers of the product. And those companies, right, are not wedded to that product, that chemistry. They'll use any chemical, right? You take the foam in the chairs that you're sitting in and the flame retardants, they'll take any chemical that's going to provide the performance and cost, and they, of course, would prefer to use a safer alternative. And the flame retardants and the foam actually is a really interesting case where you can eliminate the use of the flame retardant and still not compromise fire safety, and that's right, the best solution. But sometimes you can also go to and use a safer alternative. So I was learning about these market campaigns, and I had, right, it was a slow aha. It wasn't that 30-second aha that Stefan mentioned this morning. It was over time. It was like, oh, look at that, right? You can business, and in my community, we talk about business as a monolith, right? When environmentalists talk about environmental issues, a lot of times they're like, well, there's business, and they're the source of the problem. Whereas now I really see business as much more nuanced, right? Who's using these brominated flame retardants? Why are they using it? How can we get them to be thinking about other alternatives? And at the same time, and this was something I didn't recognize at the time that I was doing my dissertation research, was one of the great things about being a PhD researcher is you get to go out and, in this case, ask anybody for an interview, and they almost would invariably grant it. And so I got a chance to go out and talk to pulp and paper manufacturers, to government regulators, to environmental groups, to the downstream buyers of paper. And I interviewed them, and of course, being part of a researcher, my goal was to really understand what were the barriers that they were confronting in their organizations to change? What were the opportunities for change that they saw? And that really started to influence my thinking about, well, how can we start to engage individuals and organizations to create change. And I think TJ's presentation is really interesting because I look at her and the people that I work a lot with in business, and there was a really nice article by Meyerson and Scully in a business journal talking about tempered radicals. People in organizations who bring a set of values that are more progressive to their organization and try and work their way to make that activity happen. And so my space, right, is about how do you transform the chemical industry by working with people in companies. And I find it so exciting to work with tempered radicals because they are change agents in their organization. So a few years later, after my dissertation research ended, I ended up forming an entity. And you might pronounce this BizNGO or BizNGO, but what the organization is BizNGO, as in business non-governmental organization, and NGOs are often what, in international parlance of the United Nations, for example, we talk about NGOs as environmental organizations. And so the long title for BizNGO is Business NGO Working Group for Safer Chemicals and Sustainable Materials. And what I'm going to do is lead you through some of the key elements that I've seen as what's been really successful for BizNGO in creating change. And so, for example, we've worked a lot here in Washington State on how do you identify safer alternatives to toxic chemicals. Because at the government level, you're not going to take action until they know that there's a safer alternative, right? They're not going to outright ban a chemical because it creates this economic disruption. And so how do you identify alternatives? And it's not just, we don't want just another alternative that's equally bad, right? You just ban one chemical and you get another alternative. We want a safer alternative. So BizNGO has created a whole framework for how do you evaluate and identify safer alternatives and work closely with Washington State. We've been very effective in California in terms of regulations there called the Safer Consumer Product Regulations because we brought business and environmental groups to the table. And it wasn't just business saying, well, you can't do it that way. It's more business being reflective and constructive about how do you create a regulation that business can actually implement. And let me tell you, regulators don't get that very often, right? You can't do that. So that's some of the impact of BizNGO, and I'll tell you a little bit about a catalyst to a new initiative that we're launching. But a critical element to BizNGO, and I like this image here of the people moving the puzzle pieces because I intentionally named it the BizNGO Working Group because a critical element, right, of getting people from different cultures, because it really is different cultures. Environmentalists and businesses, they have different language. They have different norms of practice. They have different ways of interacting. And so how do you get businesses and environmental groups to come together and to work together and be productive and not just be a talk fest? And so what was critical to our work is doing specific projects. So we've done case studies, and I mentioned earlier, we've created a framework for alternatives assessment. So we come together and we create resources. We develop materials where we send into governments in terms of testifying related to different regulations and laws. And that's been critical because that engages in dialogue. We learn how to share language, come to common language. And another part that's been really critical, and especially for me, is vision. Because when I came to this work, I didn't want to be compromising my values in terms of what I'm trying to achieve. And so the first task, actually, of BizNGO was to create a set of principles, what we call principles for safer chemicals. It's 4 principles, but it was very aspirational. But we did it as aspirational principles to try and achieve. But the other side of it relating to the business part was we looked out at what were best practices in business in terms of avoiding chemicals of concern and moving to safer alternatives. And so the principles then said, okay, we will take the very best practices across all companies, across all sectors, and made those our principles. So the companies could sign on to it because they could say, oh, we can see how we could actually do this. We recognize that it's going to be really challenging to achieve all of these, but we'll sign on. And then the tempered radicals in the group was really interesting. What they were doing as we were writing this and debating the language, they then, when we got it near to completion, they then took it into their organizations and got their organization to adopt it. They changed the language oftentimes. Instead of principles, they would call it a policy or a guideline or a strategy. So they reframed it. They got their organization to adopt it in new language in that organization. Then when we released the principles, they could go back in and say, hey, we can sign on to this. Look, it just aligns exactly with what we already have in place. And for me, like, this is so much the fun part of this work. I was mentioning the battle earlier, right? The battle between the chemical industry and environmentalists. And sometimes you feel like you're just pounding your head against the wall. And this is really fun work because we're actually working together and figuring out how do we find common ground? How do we find common solutions and move forward? So a third element that I see is been really critical to our success is creating value, right? Creating value for the people who are participating. And one thing that people that participate in BizNGO find is, they learn a lot from business-to-business communication. So frequently, when you're in a sector, if you're in electronics, you tend to go to conferences and meetings where you're talking to other electronics firms. You don't go to a meeting where you're talking to other people in the building product sector or personal care products. So like we have Hewlett-Packard, we have Levi Strauss, we've got Staples, right? So we've got Kaiser Permanente. So you've got this mix of different sectors, and at the same time, you also have this opportunity to network with environmental groups. And we run an annual meeting, and we also have 4 working groups that are going on throughout the year. We just had our last annual meeting in December, and after that meeting, I was talking to a fellow in one of the businesses, and he says, this is incredible value. Like in 2 days here, I can get 2 years of networking time in, because I can come in and meet people who are doing this work, who are experts in the field, and find out what they're thinking. And for businesses to get a pulse on where environmental groups are at is incredibly valuable. And the other part, and the last ingredient, which I see as just critical to the whole success, it's a bit like water to life, is trust. You can't have an effective collaboration without trust. And what we've created with BizNGO is a safe haven where people can come in and really talk about their challenges. So companies are really reluctant to sit down and openly discuss the challenges that they confront in their work. They want to come out and say, well, we did this work and we achieved this, we have this new safer alternative, now we want to talk about it. They want to talk about it after they've done it, not while they're in the process of wrestling through it. And so we've created this space where people can talk about the challenges that they confront, where environmental groups can come forward and really engage the companies can engage the environmental groups. And so one of the really interesting outcomes of this, TJ was mentioning carbon footprinting. BizNGO is now a catalyst to a new initiative called the Chemical Footprint Project. So like you have carbon footprinting and water footprinting, we want to create this space for chemical footprinting. How do you measure progress away from toxic chemicals to safer alternatives? And I think it's a really powerful new initiative. We're bringing in the investor community. So we now have investors signed on with over $2 trillion in assets under management. And it's a way to, how do we scale this work? How do we really show progress away from toxic chemicals to safer alternatives? So I look forward to and maybe some of you are on this journey around the movement away from toxic chemicals in products, thinking about like the products that you use in your home or your company. So I welcome an opportunity to talk with you later, to learn about your work and to find ways of collaborating. Thank you very much.